Thank you everyone for coming. Great to be here. What I'm going to talk about is one of the reforms I was associated with when I was a chief economic advisor to the government of India, which is implementing a nationwide major tax reform called the value-added tax, which in India we call it the goods and services tax. And since the theme of the conference is about complexity and doing things at scale, this seems like a reasonable candidate that meets some of these criteria. So let me begin by going back to my favorite chart, not because I produced it, but my favorite chart, trying to understand some of these issues that Frank raised yesterday, for example. That is that, democracy and state capacity, there is not always sort of consonance or consistency between them, that there's some tension. So I wrote a review of why nations fail, essentially saying why nations fail is it can be expressed in one chart. Economic development is caused by political development, and whether you measure this as PPP or state capacity, you generally get this relationship. It's a fantastically strong relationship, so that the theory holds very well on average. The problem, of course, is that the theory has two major exceptions, which is China and India are in completely opposite directions. China, for its level of political development, doesn't deserve to have the kind of state capacity and levels of development that it has. India, fantastically democratic, deserves to be much richer, and yet seems to be underperforming relative to the theory. So I ended the review by saying that the problem is not with the theory, but maybe the pesky reality of India and China that makes this generalization somewhat we need to be guarded about any generalizations of this sort. I also say this because I want to come back to kind of India and democracy and the relationship with state capacity at the end. I don't know how many of you know India, but I think just to give a sense of scale and complexity, this is a chart that my friend, so this is India, and this puts, we have 29 states, and it puts the nearest comparable country in population for each state. So this is Brazil, this is Mexico, Thailand, Iran, Japan, Germany, France, Turkey, Canada, Iraq, Vietnam, Mexico, Zimbabwe, all in one country. If I were a little bit more creative, I'd combine these two and say United States of America. So so it is very important when I talk about this major reform that to understand this not just as a large country with a big population, but actually a federal polity, because these 29 kind of states have a lot of sovereignty and independence. So we're really talking about 29 plus 1 quasi-sovereign entities when we discuss the tax reform that I'm going to. So Lant Pritchett has this great description of the Indian state as a flailing state. It's a lovely metaphor. It kind of captures everything. But I want to argue that that's actually a little bit misleading or inadequate description of the Indian state. That the Indian state, what's most striking about it is its heterogeneity, that is both flailing, middling, and delivering all at the same time. Apparently there's a joke, something associated with Larry Summers. When people ask him, how good are you at tennis? He says, I am better than you have any right to believe looking at me. So essentially I want to argue that the Indian state, when it comes to the GST, does much better than what Lant, as the custodian of knowledge in the North Atlantic seaboard, would like you to believe, because it's been quite a impressive achievement. But I think the bigger puzzle for me is in fact to understand this heterogeneity within India. Huge failures of state capacity, especially when it comes to delivering health and education. We all know learning outcomes in India have been stagnant and poor. Medical benefits are inaccessible to a large swathe of the population. So, on that score, India doesn't do very well. But it's had major successes in what I would call episodic delivery and accountability. So one-off things, some things India can do phenomenally. So for example, elections are beginning next week, and we're going to have elections in which 900 million people are going to vote. And given the record of past elections, this will be much better than the United States and Florida and what do they call it, hanging chads and all of that stuff. Elections are held with great regularity, with great competence, and generally fair, without politicization. We send unmanned missions to Mars. And we're great at organizing events. For example, this year we had an event where 150 million people assembled for religious pilgrimage in one spot over the course of 50 days. So that's like, and on the last day there were like 12 million people at one spot, 1.2 million toilets were constructed, a kind of city this half the size of Manhattan was built and kind of destroyed or whatever, dismantled over the course of. So the episodic delivery, the Indian state, certain things is very good. But today I'm going to argue that increasingly it's also beginning to be able to do things that involve ongoing delivery and accountability, which is what I think deeper state capacity is about. On an ongoing basis, can you deliver and are you accountable? India is doing several things on scale. We have a national guarantee scheme, a rural employment guarantee, which covers the entire country. We have what I call a JAM, which is financial inclusion, biometric identification, and mobile have come together. So, for example, there are 1 billion people in India with biometric identification, 600 million bank accounts, about 600 to 700 million mobile phones, and all of these are being connected in a way that will allow some services like maybe cash transfers, etc., to be delivered more effectively. And of course, I would say the kind of mother of all doing things at scale is the goods and services tax, the GST, which I'm going to talk about. So the benefits of this, was going to be a nationwide tax. And I would argue that it had, political, administrative, and technological kind of dimensions. And on each of these scores, I think the tax was a phenomenal success, not without problems, which I'll come to, but phenomenal success. So politically, if you think about it, these were 29 states, each collecting in this arena 3% of GDP in terms of taxes, which they were willing to give up sovereignty and decide to pool that sovereignty together. So 29 plus 1 states becoming, and second, 29 different tax administrations. You had to create a common technology platform. So politically and administratively and technologically, it was just a massive exercise. Just to give you a sense, there are 11.4 million registered taxpayers. Almost, and all these numbers were as of 3 to 4 months ago, so you have to multiply them by a factor of about 20 or so, 20%. So today they're probably 1 million payments a day, 1.8 million tax returns every day. And so it's really a massive kind of exercise being done at scale and complexity, of which I think Ricardo would not be unproud about. So this is really a massive exercise. And of course, the reform involved achieving simplicity also to a great degree. So benefits, it was going to have huge benefits. It was going to create one market in India, improve voluntary compliance, increase formalization, but also trying to reduce the interface between the taxpayer and the tax administration, which is a big source of corruption in many countries. And of course, it was also going to be a robust source of revenue going forward. So these were all the benefits. And now I'm going to talk about 3 or 4 dimensions of this. So the design challenge. So I was assigned the task of coming up with a blueprint for the design of this goods and services tax. And of course, if you look around the world, almost every country except the United States and Saudi Arabia, I think, have a value-added tax. And most countries, about 80 to 90% of countries now have one rate, because it's very simple, administratively easy to implement. And of course, in a world where the distinction between goods and services is blurring, it makes sense not to make any distinctions and just have one seamless tax. But the point was that state level, there were 29 plus 1, 30 sovereign entities here, and each one has his or own preference as to what should be taxed higher, what should be taxed lower. So you get a kind of proliferation of demands to make the tax structure very complicated. One state grows one agricultural product, another state grows another agricultural product, so it becomes like a real kind of bargaining where everyone says, no, my commodity should be taxed lower, and so on. So that was one kind of tug making this tax very complex. The other is what I call a residual socialism in India, that everything that you do has to serve a redistributional objective. So there are essentials, there are luxuries, everything else, and because any change in the tax is going to have redistributional effects, and because the instruments for redistribution in India are still quite limited, the imperative of making redistribution part of the design just is simply unavoidable. So that's why instead of having one rate for all goods and services, these compromises, you had to balance efficiency and simplicity with kind of politics and ideology. I recommended a 3-rate structure. One for most commodities, and then it turned out to be much more complicated than it needed to be. Avinash Dixit says, the world is second best at best. I suspect here that we got into a third or fourth or fifth best, but unavoidable. And this is what I think you have to tailor things to the circumstance. We could have done slightly better, but not a whole lot better than we did. Implementation I've been through, we had technology. The interesting thing was this tax came on top of another major policy action taken by the Indian government, demonetization, and both of them had impacted the same small scale sector, and therefore having to deal with this constituency that was in a sense twice impacted was part of the big political challenge, and this is something that had to be done. So, we also got lucky in terms of navigating the politics, because this tax had been around for a long time in India, but suddenly we found ourselves with a favorable political constellation, because the party in power had a majority, but many of these 29 state governments also belonged to this party, and therefore it commanded more support. The interesting thing that happened, of course, that the states that were previously opposing the GST were net producing states, net exporting states, and the GST, India was going to go from a tax broadly on production to tax on consumption. So net exporting states were going to lose and net consuming states were going to benefit. But in the political reconfiguration that happened, those that were going to lose became part of the government, and therefore they couldn't be as vociferously opposed to the tax as they were otherwise, and so that helped get consensus. And also that the center, this was very important part of the political buy-in. The center said we will compensate the states for any revenue loss for a period of 5 years, and that's how the politics got sorted out, and we got buy-in from all the states. Another very important point was that we've had a history of robust deliberation on indirect taxes, and here there was one key innovation that happened 15, 20 years ago when similar discussions were taking place with the center and the states. The then government in power did this masterly thing of saying that this committee comprising the central and state finance ministers would always be headed by someone from the opposition party, not from the ruling party. And that was a brilliant innovation. It kind of facilitated the kind of consensus and discussions, which I think we did very well in terms of all the mid-course corrections that we had to do. Because state capacity is also about doing and doing, learning by erring and learning by making errors. And what happened was over the course of the last year, lots of mistakes were made, but some of them were also corrected as part of this rich deliberative process of consultation and so on. So I want to just end now with a puzzle. It's a very successful tax, done very well, a feat of politics, administration, and technology. It's having some teething issues. I think we'll iron them out. But for me, the puzzle is still a little bit unanswered. Coming back to Lance's question, why is still what is it about tax that makes state capacity better in India than the state's ability to deliver health and education? even more, why is indirect tax capacity in India actually better than the capacity of the state to collect income and property taxes? We do well on indirect taxes. The GST is a major reform, but we don't do very well. This is a chart which shows the number of income taxpayers relative to voting age population. So India's it's about 5%. So basically 5% of the voting age population votes, whereas it's 50 and 100 in most advanced countries. And this is somewhat unusual, even allowing for India's level of development. So the question is still, yes, we did a pretty good job on this tax, but why don't we do better on other tax issues, and why don't we do better on non-tax issues? I have kind of tentative answers or tentative hypotheses. It could be that indirect tax is generally everywhere easier to implement than direct taxes, so it makes it a bit easier. The GST and value-added taxes, reduce demands on state capacity because it's a self-policing tax. Everyone has an incentive to ask the guy behind him in the chain, how much he paid and so on, because in order to get tax credits, you have to show that you bought it from someone. So there's a kind of inbuilt policing in the self-policing in the system that reduces. So that's why I think value-added taxes around the world are very, I think, popular. I think we've also had a history in India of having relatively decent indirect taxes, so historical forces also play a role. But I want to end just by speculating that there is, going back to that initial chart that I showed you, there is something about weak accountability mechanisms when it comes to health and education and other soft services, other human capital related things, that there's some kind of problem of democratic accountability that leads to poorer delivery of these other things. And here, in some sense, citizens are not asking for things to be done. They're just saying, stay off us, get off our backs. So maybe that helps in implementing these indirect taxes. But I think the puzzle remains that we do well in some areas, but don't do well in others. And so on that note, I want to say that this puzzle, we'll have to think further about this as we look forward. Thank you.